In terms of the radio, there's 270 odd commercial radio stations over more than 100 licensed radio licensed areas. In newspaper terms, we have one of the highest circulation rates of newspapers and magazines in the world. One of the key developments over recent years has been the review of the converging media. We have regulatory frameworks for television, pay TV, radio, online, etc. There are a number of different standards for very similar content. So a key issue over the last couple of years has been how this can be combined into a uniform and consistent regulatory framework, and I'll touch upon that a bit more later on. In terms of our major news outlets, they all have a very strong online presence, and a recent development has been those online providers are now moving to a paywall situation so they can monetise their online presence. Moving on to media ownership, the key policy provision is that ownership of Australian media belongs to Australians. So there are a range of policies that establish ownership is predominantly Australian based. As I said, we have a mixture of private and public ownership and non-profit community broadcasters. The two most dominant newspaper owners belong to Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and John Fairfax Limited. And as you can see, they have almost a monopoly across all major capital city newspapers. This image here gives you a broad overview of the ownership of Australian media. However, it is a ever-changing situation, and since that graphic was developed, Publishing Broadcasting Limited has disposed of its ownership of Channel 9, that's owned by a separate venture company, and Foxtel is now owned 50% by News Limited, 50% by Telstra. So, and also Publishing Broadcasting Limited sold all its magazine publishing assets to Bauer Media, which is a major German media provider. So it is a forever changing landscape through mergers and acquisitions and change of ownership, but the issues about Australian control remain. Following on from the graphic, some of the major operators, Seven Media Group, which has television, newspaper, magazine assets, and it also has an alliance with Yahoo 7. Nine Entertainment Co, Channel 9, it recently changed ownership to a separate venture company, but it has a very strong tie with 9%. And the third player at the moment is Network 10 Holdings. It is probably the broadcaster that's struggling the most in the Australian market. However, in recent changes to its ownership structure, Lachlan Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch, is now chairman and a stakeholder in Network 10, as is James Packer, whose family owned Channel 9 for many decades. And the third key stakeholder in Network 10 is Australia's most wealthiest woman, Gina Reinhardt, who is a mining billionaire, and she has also taken a stake in the ownership of Network 10. In terms of press, as I mentioned, News Limited is a dominant provider and also has half ownership of Foxtel. Fairfax Media, which is the other major dominant media provider in the press area, it owns quite a number of rural papers across regional Australia. As mentioned, Bauer magazine has acquired all the content of Consolidated Press Holdings, so the major weekly magazines under that umbrella now. And Southern Cross Broadcasting is an affiliate of Network 10 thumbnail sketch of the media landscape and ownership in Australia. The key part of the presentation is more about the media regulation, and based on the opening presentation, for media regulation in Australia, it's a co-regulatory model. Direct government regulation is limited to a couple of main areas, that is the telecommunications laws and the corporations laws. So by those two main components sets the regulatory framework for media regulation. And beneath the government component is the self-regulatory or co-regulatory bodies which assist to promote regulation and the media interest, and certainly promote the freedom of the press, and that is a key element of what they do. The key piece of government legislation is the Broadcasting Services Act. That was reformed in 2007 to change some ownership structures and establish some cross-ownership restrictions on media markets. The key element of that is a 2 out of 3 rule. That means that in any particular major city, a media owner can only have 2 out of 3, 2 out of television, radio or press. So that is one of the key components of the regulatory framework for Australian media, 2 out of 3 rule. That has been subject to recent debate, but at this stage there's been no move to change that. In terms of media regulation, the key government entity is the Australian Communications and Media Authority. ACMA has responsibility for administration of the Broadcasting Services Act, and it is the body that authorises the codes under which the self-regulatory organisations work. So the commercial television standards, the press council standards and the commercial radio code of practice, those components are developed by the self-regulatory body, but given authorisation and given power through the authority of the Communications and Media Authority. As I mentioned, the body looks after those different standards. The Commercial Television Code of Practice, it sets the broad foundation for content classification, advertising, complaints handling processes. Under the Code of Practice, the advertising of broadcasting television has to go through a pre-vetting process. The key element for each of these codes is a complaint handling process. However, in all cases, the first point of contact is back to the media proprietor or radio station, TV station, newspaper, as the first port of call for a complaint. If the consumer is unhappy with the result of the complaint, then the self-regulatory body will be a second stage of the complaint handling system. So that is a bit different to the advertising industry, but in the media industry there are 2 stages of the process. First of all to the proprietor, and then to the self-regulatory organisation after that. As I mentioned, the relationship between government and media, I've described as being spirited. That's probably a very polite term. Following the news of the world hacking scandal in the UK, the government reacted quite quickly and possibly in a knee-jerk way to implement a number of inquiries into deep elements of the media, and this was also overarched by 2 major inquiries. The first major inquiry was to do with the increasing convergence between those different forms of media and how we can identify and realign the regulatory frameworks applying to all of those different media while the content is pretty much the same. And the second inquiry was to do with media ownership. The independent media inquiry, which was undertaken by a retired judge, Judge Finkelstein, and known as the Finkelstein Review, it reported to government in September 2011. The outcomes of the Finkelstein Review were also fed into a separate convergence review, which presented its details to government in March 2012. Interestingly, the outcome of the Finkelstein Review and some of the recommendations made by that were acted upon by industry long before the government had time to consider and respond to the results of the inquiries. Only a matter of 3 or 4 weeks ago, the federal government introduced a package of bills into the Parliament based upon the outcome of both the convergence review and the Finkelstein inquiry, and I'll touch on those in a moment. The terms of reference to the Finkelstein inquiry were fairly broad. The key elements were that they were to review the code of practice applying across media, review the impact of those changes, review the impact of technological changes on those business models, particularly in the areas of investment into journalism, and ensure that the news production remains of high quality. The third point of term of reference was to do with the independence and effectiveness of the Australian Press Council. It had been criticised in the past for not being a robust self-regulatory body, and so the government wanted that to be examined as part of the review. And the last part was very broad in terms of any other issue relating to public interest, and that was a very broad and open-ended component of the review. As I mentioned, the Press Council responded to the Finkelstein inquiry report well before government had considered it, and it has implemented changes to strengthen the council to cover more broadly print and online. Previously it was just in the print media, transforming its scope and having industry contribute more to the operation of the Press Council. As I mentioned, the government introduced a package of bills into the Parliament. The key bills that were of concern were the Public Interest Media Advocate Bill, where it proposed a single person to be the public interest advocate and have a key decision-making role in terms of ownership and testing the public interest. The other bill which had major concern was to do with the change of ownership, or the potential change of ownership, and there were, interestingly enough, a number of the media proprietors who fought against those changes. The government did a very poor job in trying to push these amendments through the Parliament. It gave the Parliament less than 2 weeks to consider these bills, and noting that the Australian government is a minority government with the support of a couple of independents to retain power, they took a very brave step in trying to ram these amendments